Welcome to The State of Us.
Beyond mainstream cable news and party lines, with a millennial and a boomer, The State of Us pushes past the noise and uncovers all the issues that matter.
Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
The battle for the Supreme Court. Why do we fight so ferociously over this judicial entity? Well, there's a lot of reasons, and I think many of our listeners out there are going to have stuff that comes to mind, right? It could be how you feel about abortion one way or the other, how you feel about gay marriage one way or the other. But really, folks, while those are things that we're going to talk about in relation to the Supreme Court, part of what we want to do is uncover the other reasons you should care about the court. Some of the things that it does that maybe are not as sexy and not as exciting, that aren't quite in the limelight all the time, but also talk about, is this really the Supreme Court that we want? Is it the Supreme Court that we should have? And if the answer to those questions are maybe there's something better out there, what is that better scenario? Can we sell Lance on changing the Supreme Court? Well, maybe. And if the Supreme Court needs to be changed, how do we make sure it's done in an equitable way? We got a lot of questions, and the man with the answers, here he is.
True Chat senior historian and an educator of more than 30 years. Here is your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
Well, I'm going to use two words together in the same sentence, and that is entertain by talking about the Supreme Court. Usually don't think of the Supreme Court as something that will entertain you, but we are going to try to do that today, give you some background information on the court, what it's doing, and what are some possible changes to make it work in today's society. The idea being that, if we think about it, the Constitution has been described by many historians as a living, breathing document. That was the reason that we hold up our founding fathers, is that they were intelligent enough to create a form of government that could adapt and change to the changing times, which is why it's been in place for so long, is that it isn't the same thing that they wrote, but they wrote it with the ability for it to change and adapt as society was changing. And so I think it's a very interesting topic, and hopefully you'll stay with us and will interest you and entertain you. The word of the day is penumbra. A penumbra, it is a noun, and we're going to use the third definition in Webster's dictionary. The third definition is a vague, indefinite, or borderline area. So I chose that word because it kind of describes what the Supreme Court does with the law. It kind of finds these vague areas and then determines and gives us an answer. And the discussion today is why is the Supreme Court giving us an answer? Don't we have a legislative branch that's supposed to make the law? Stay tuned. You're going to find out. So what do we have first, Justin?
So penumbra.
P-E, I'm sorry, I'm supposed to spell that, aren't I?
Yeah.
P-E-N-U-M-B-R-A.
P-E-N-U-M-B-R-A. Lance, I just like it to be noted that I wrote it down, and the Devon creature can testify to this, but he probably wasn't paying attention because he does other stuff while we're recording since he thinks this show's useless. But I was writing it down prior to when you just spelled it, and I got it spelled right. And I want that to be noted in the minutes that today. Can you let our audience know what the first two words of the day were? Oh,
what have been the last two words of the day?
Aren't those the same thing?
You're supposed to put them into our conversations. We're trying to educate our audience, right?
All of them?
Yeah. We're
I'm
trying
lucky to remember one of them, Lance.
That's our mission statement, to educate people, right? Through respectful conversations.
Yes.
So if we keep adding these words of the day and we put them in everybody's vocabulary, we'll be educating them on how to have a respectful conversation.
So penumbra is a noun, though, so I have to be careful. Don't want to use it as an adjective. That would be.
It's a vague, indistinct area of an issue.
We should quiz the Devon creature on the difference between a noun and an adjective. But as we talk about the Supreme Court, I do think
Schoolhouse Rock, everybody. Just look up Schoolhouse Rock.
That'll tell you everything.
That'll tell you the difference between all of that stuff.
When we think about the Supreme Court, though, and this is what I think part of our theme today is, we all kind of have this idea, right, of this entity that every now and then we hear something from that marks a shift in the country. And at least lately, those things that we've noted are often civil rights shifts of some kind. For example, most recently, there was the Supreme Court's decision basically acknowledging or clarifying that the 1964 Civil Rights Act does actually indeed protect from discrimination. In other words, it protects somebody from being fired on the basis of their sexual orientation, which was surprising because, again, this is one of those times where this is a law from 1964, right? And the law hasn't changed, but the Supreme Court has said after a case was brought before them that the law does indeed protect that. And that's where we get into, and I think this is what confuses people a lot about the Supreme Court, Lance, right, is how is that possible? How can we have a law from that long ago that we then are looking at now and saying, well, now it protects this thing? And that's obviously just one example. But that depends. And that's where it gets confusing, where you get into all this judicial philosophy, right? These different, the different ways that judges look at stuff. And we don't want to get down in the weeds and all of that. But I think it's important to understand that's part of why we fight over it, right? We tend to fight about things, especially when we don't fully understand things. We try to make it simpler, and then we try to break it down into camps, right? You either want conservatives or liberals on the court. And I think we want good justices on the court, or that should be what we want. But the problem is the justices are humans, right, Lance? So, I mean, they have different ways that they think you should look at the Constitution and that you should approach court cases. And that doesn't mean just because they have different ways that any way is necessarily right, wrong, or otherwise, because the Constitution doesn't say that the Supreme Court has to approach things in any certain way. It just tells us that there shall be one Supreme Court and that the judicial authority of the United States shall be vested in that court, and that it has the authority to create other subsidiary courts as it sees fit.
Okay, well, the thing with the Supreme Court is it looks at the penumbra of the issue. And so they look at that vague area that you have a law and then something changes in society. And then all of a sudden, Congress doesn't pass a new law. So the Supreme Court is asked to interpret the existing law. And does this new guideline or does this new idea fit into the law as it is written? And that's what their job is. So the Supreme Court's always working on the periphery. They're always taking laws, that's why, and people say that, well, the Supreme Court makes law. No, they don't make the law. They interpret law. And if the legislative branch does not make a new law to take care of something that comes up in society, then people ask the courts to say, okay, what's the answer here? We don't know. Our legislators are not making a law to cover this. Should I have the freedom to be with whomever I want and still hold my job? So the legislative branch hasn't made that decision by a law. So then we have to go to the courts and say, okay, under the existing laws that we have, do I have that right? Do I have the right to live with anybody that I want to and still hold my job? And so that's where people get upset and say the Supreme Court's making law. They're not making law. They're just interpreting existing law. And because the legislative branch has fallen short and not passed a law to cover the new things that are popping up, people go, well, we need an answer from somebody. So we go to the court. And then, as you point out, the court's job is to, look at existing law and find out whether or not it falls under any aspect of the Constitution that we have. And they are individuals who bring their own biases and their own opinions to the court, their own feelings. They're supposed to set those aside and just decide on the basis of the Constitution. But let's face it, every decision that we all make as humans, we bring our own biases into it. Sometimes we tamp them down and try to be, and I think most of the time we try to be as fair as possible. And sometimes our biases are subliminal. We don't even know that we're biasing ourselves in our decision making. And so it's just the nature of being humans that this comes out.
The reason that all this is important to understand is because for so many people, the Supreme Court ultimately makes decisions that either impact their lives directly or impact the direction of the country. And that's not just, we're not talking just about social issues. They rule constantly on all manner of cases involving business, involving the economy, involving what states can do with their laws in regard to the federal government. Lots of things that for most of us would seem pretty boring, but collectively have a very big impact on the direction of the company. And as far as the branches of government goes, I think it's typically the branch, Lance, that receives the least attention on a regular basis. They receive the attention when they do something big and flashy, but that's about it. You know, we hear about the infighting in Congress, and we see Nancy Pelosi, and we see Donald Trump on TV, right? We see the legislative and executive branches pontificating and doing their thing. We don't see the Supreme Court nearly as often, and even when we do, because the Supreme Court hearings are not filmed the way that, you know, it is, for example, in the houses of Congress. I think it's just, there's a little bit more of that curtain over the Supreme Court, which is intentional, by the way, just so that people are clear. It's not an accidental thing, but I think that that's part of where we get into this. And that's as people have become, you know, whatever side you come down on as we continue our conversation today, you may be very happy that President Trump's been able to appoint 3 justices to the Supreme Court in his term. On the other side, and on that same side, you may be very worried now that, you know, it looks like President Trump was a one-term president. You may be worried that Biden's going to try to stack the court. And on the flip side, if you're supportive of Biden, you may be wanting him to stack the court. And so what do we do with all of this, right? Is this really the way it should be? Do we want some presidents to appoint multiple justices, other presidents to appoint none? And what did the founding fathers have to say about the Supreme Court? How has the Supreme Court changed over the years? All questions that we have to answer that answer this fundamental question about the battle for the Supreme Court. And what should we do about it in the future? Because we're really focused on that. Where do we go from here? To find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
President Donald J. Trump appointed 3 justices to the Supreme Court during his time in office, and yes, still in office. I suppose there is the possibility that he could get another 1 or 2 in here, depending on the court. But the reality is, there's a decent chance that unless something changes, President-elect Joe Biden won't put anybody on the Supreme Court. That's possible, you know. So again, regardless of whether you're Trump, Biden supporter, whatever, you can flip the roles around. The whole thing is, if we step back here, Lance, right, and we look at this, is that really, do we really want one president to get to appoint 3 justices just because he got lucky? And yeah, and lucky, it sounds harsh because, you know, obviously some of these people died. So I don't mean to make it sound like, ooh, you got lucky because somebody died. But I mean, that's the reality, right? So, I mean, you just don't know. If you're going to run for president, you may get to appoint 9 Supreme Court justices. You may get to appoint 0 Supreme Court justices. You have no idea going into it what you will or will not get to do. And I think that it begs the question of, and this is what we want to talk about before we talk about the solution, why is the court set up this way? I mean, it seems like, right, just if you just said no president ever knows, but they have the power to do it if it so happens to happen during their term, it seems kind of crazy that would be how we do this, is we just, some people get lucky and others don't, and we'll see what happens.
Well, the argument is because at the federal level, a federal judge is appointed for life. You know, your state judges, you're not. Like we just had, the election here in Ohio, and we voted for judges at the local level, at the county level, at the state level. But our founding fathers said, you know what? We want the courts to be above any kind of politics. We want people to be able to vote their conscience and decide what's right for all of us, because obviously when you go to court, they have to make a decision. They don't just get to debate or push it down the road like, oh yeah, well, we really can't come up with a budget. We'll decide that in another year. The court, when we go to court, if anybody's ever gone to court or been a part of that system, we go to court or somebody takes us to court because there's a dispute and both sides want a decision. So we expect a decision from the courts, and the founding fathers were thoughtful enough, I think, to understand that when we make those decisions, when we're the person that makes that decision, we obviously make one side happy and we upset the other side for the most part. I mean, it's hard to make a decision that's going to make, both the defendant and the plaintiff, happy. And so they said, well, you know what? We need to make sure that these people are above that kind of partisanship and that we'll let them just stay there forever. Once they're there, unless they commit high crimes and misdemeanor, or they want to retire, or their time on earth is over, they get to be on the Supreme Court, because we don't want them to say, ooh, I've got an election coming up, so I better decide this so I get reelected to the Supreme Court. So that's where we get the situation where it looks like a one-term president is going to get to change 33% of the court, and the incoming president, if they serve 2 terms, might not replace anybody. So that's the why, to answer your question, is that the founding fathers said an appointment to the Supreme Court is a lifetime endeavor, because we want them to feel free to make the right decision, not the one that the public would like to be seen made at that time.
When you talk about the role of the Supreme Court, I think it's important to hear what the court says its role is. And here's what we got, Lance. This is from United States Courts, uscourts.gov. So this is the official website of the courts of the United States. So I'm not sure if we can get any more official than that, but they end the paragraph about the role of the Supreme Court, and they say this: in essence, the Supreme Court serves to ensure that the changing views of a majority do not undermine the fundamental values common to all Americans, such as freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and the due process of law. That's their, in essence, this is what it does. They list 4 other things specifically that it does. The second thing they list, Lance, and this is what we have to talk a little bit about, is the power of judicial review, because this, I think, is the best known power of the Supreme Court, right? Is the power of judicial review. What is judicial review? It's essentially the ability of the Supreme Court to declare something as in violation of the Constitution, right? Because those are the flashy cases that we get to hear about, is, this is a violation of the Constitution. Your executive action or your legislative law, nope, it's, we're striking it down because it's not part of it, or it flies in the face of the Constitution. But this is not a power that this court actually has spelled out in the Constitution.
We were a nation for 27 years before the whole concept of judicial review came about in the courts.
Well, I think that's because, Lance, right, the Constitution leaves us with a penumbra. There's this gap where we kind of get this vague language, right, about what the Supreme Court does, and it's just kind of left out there and say, yep, we'll kind of we'll see how it goes, right? We'll see how it's figured out. And for what it's worth, for those that don't know, I mean, that's kind of how the Constitution is on a number of things. Some things it gets relatively specific on, and other things, I think a lot of things, Lance, right, that the founding fathers were kind of like, we're kind of at the end of our rope here, right? We've done what we can do. We've set this up in such a way that it's not terribly specific, so that as the people doing the job do the job, they can start to define the job better.
Right. And they had a vision that they wanted the country to be around for a long, long time. And they were intelligent enough to know that things are going to change. Things had changed in their lifetime. So you can't write, you can, but you're not going to write a legal document that exists for very long if you only write it to cover things as they stand in your current situation. And like I said in the first episode, that's the beauty of what the founding fathers did in the Constitution. They wrote a document that's allowed to all of a sudden talk about having an Air Force, to talk about, the idea that we're going to get rid of owning other human beings.
One thing I think we can say is this whole idea that the founding fathers expected something to be set in stone flies contrary to the very thing they did. Keep in mind, right, folks, the Constitution is not the original governing document of the United States of America. Within their lifetimes, they completely threw out our first Constitution, our Articles of Confederation. They wiped them out and started over with a whole new document. So the idea that they thought that things should never change, I think, is one that we can pretty definitively say they obviously believed that sometimes you don't get it right the first time round and you got to go in for a second chance, because that's what they did. They sat there and they acknowledged, look, these Articles of Confederation, they suck. They are not doing what we need them to do. So we're going to change it. We're going to make it better and move forward. And I think that's the message that we have to take away. And we're going to talk a little bit about, in that spirit, should the Supreme Court be changed? Well, I think we've said we're open to it. So is there a change that we all could feel good about? Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
As we've looked at the Supreme Court, the question has come up, should it be changed? Well, I think Lance and I would say that we try to be pretty open, generally, to looking at possibilities to improve stuff. I think for most of us, right, whether you're on the conservative side, the liberal side, somewhere in between, the idea that that one president might get to appoint 3 or 4 justices and another president gets to appoint none, seems a little strange. It seems like that something wasn't quite thought all the way out there. And in the defense of the Founding Fathers, they left plenty of penumbras in the Constitution. And I think that that's because, as we've talked about, they just couldn't be expected to figure everything out. And they also had the foresight to realize, look, we had to throw out our founding document, right? It wasn't even around for 50 years and we had to throw it out because it wasn't working. So they understood that there might be a time in this country where we had to make some changes to it. And that's part of why I think they made the Constitution. They added the provision, right, to be able to amend it and to change it. And those amendments could clarify, they could erase, they could add new things. They can do pretty much anything. We could amend or completely replace it if we wanted to. But as we talk about the court, Lance, let's talk about some of the options out there. One of the options that we've heard a lot of talk about is just stacking the court, right? Adding, basically just essentially allowing there to be more justices appointed to the court. This one I don't love because I feel like it's just kind of one of those Band-Aid things that won't really work, because it doesn't change anything about the appointment process. It just changes the total number. So you still get into this thing of, if there's several justices within a several year age range of each other, you could lose, 3 or 4 justices around the same time, and you still be in the same position where a president might appoint 3 or 4 justices. And if we get rid of the cap, right, we could end up with 100 justices, because every president's just going to come in and stack the court with a few more so that their side has the advantage.
Well, I don't necessarily like the idea, but again, we're working on that misnomer that there have always been 9 justices on the Supreme Court. So that's an arbitrary number that we've just had in place for a long time. Again, the Constitution does not say how many justices. Obviously, the intelligent side would be to pick an odd number.
There's been as many as 10 and as few as 1.
Right. So unless somebody dissents, you end up with a decision. If you have an odd number, I mean, somebody could dissent and then you have a tie, and then you have, it reverts to whatever the law was, to start with. But so that's my only counter to what you said. You're right in that you can add and subtract and do all kinds of things to that, but you can't argue, well, there's always been 9, so we got to keep 9. No, there hasn't always been 9. The number is artificial. And so for that part, I think it's gets a bad rap when you say they're stacking the court.
A long-term, and I think a possibly a better solution, one of the ones that I'm in favor of, and different people have proposed different versions of this, so we're sharing one version, most notably the candidate in the presidential election process that seemed to say this was their plan for the Supreme Court, or something similar to this, was Mayor Pete Buttigieg from South Bend, Indiana. And the thinking here is that, the way it is right now, right, it's, as we've talked about, it's kind of the luck of the draw, right? So if, for example, what we have here, Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, passed away. And now President Trump appoints a justice that could be completely different ideologically, right? And I think by many measures, people would say is pretty different ideologically. Now, whether or not you think that's right or wrong, that's just the reality. There's no stipulation about if one justice with one ideology goes away, that you have to replace them with anybody of a similar nature for any reason. You can just put whoever you want in that position. So what this seeks to do is kind of eliminate a little bit of that by saying, look, we choose a number, preferably an odd number that is divisible by 3. So it could be 9, it could be 15. We'll just go with 9 since that's the current number, so that we're not changing necessarily the number of Supreme Court justices.
Why do we have to bring math into it? A lot of people struggle with math.
Well, I don't like math much either, Lance, but that's why I'm trying to keep it. So for our audience level,
that don't do math well, just stay with Justin here. You decided to bring math into it. A number divisible by 3. Okay.
Stick with it. So we say we have 9 justices, Lance, right? 3 of them are appointed by the Republicans. 3 of them are appointed by the Democrats, and 3 of them are chosen from the other 6. So essentially what you have is anytime one of your Republican appointed justices passes away, the Republicans get to replace that individual. Anytime one of your Democratic appointed justices passes away, the Democrats appoint the replacement. And anytime one of the other 3, which was selected by the 3 Republicans, 3 Democratic appointed justices, so the 6 collectively choose the other 3, then they also replace one of those 3. The thinking is you always have an odd number on the court. Each party that's represented in Congress has a say. And then the court also has a say in choosing 3 of its own peers. And the hope then would be that you end this back and forth, right, of the ongoing battle for the Supreme Court, and you hopefully end up with a court that has both selected some of its own members and that both parties have chosen representation for. The biggest objection I have to this is that it doesn't allow for independents to have input, because independents are not technically a political party, and we do have a few. And so they don't have the ability to then be part of that process, which I'm not a big fan of.
You've just added partisanship, the Supreme Court, by saying they're going to be a Democratic or Republican or whatever names of the political parties are. And I think that's a bad idea, because we're doing everything we can, at least on this show. We've talked about getting rid of partisanship, and by designating 3 seats to each political party on the Supreme Court, we've just added to the partisanship. And that's a technicality. My second point is much more, I think, important. And that is, we can study history, and justices don't always vote the way people thought they would. That when they are put on the Supreme Court, the largeness of that job and of that responsibility has caused conservatives to vote on what we would say liberal, and caused liberal judges to vote more conservative. So I think we're doing a misrepresentation of the idea of a Supreme Court to say that judges, we just said in the opening of the show, or I said that judges should not be political. And now this change is politicizing it even more. And I think we need to stay away from that. And I think we need to give judges the opportunity to grow into being a Supreme Court justice and make their decisions based on what you read in segment 2, that we are going to protect the minority from the majority. And I know I'm paraphrasing, but let them grow into that. Don't partisanize the one body that we have right now that's not partisan.
For what it's worth, I don't think you don't even have to look back past 2020 to get an example of what you're talking about. Just for the record, I mean, you don't have to study history. If you're alive this year, you would know that Justice Neil M. Gorsuch, appointed by President Trump, who was generally thought to be a bad move for the LGBT community, actually wrote the majority opinion saying that an employer who fires an individual merely for being gay or transgender defies the law. It was a 6-3 ruling of the Supreme Court, even when the Supreme Court had a conservative, quote unquote, bent to it, right? More justices appointed by conservatives than liberals. And yes, that lends itself to Lance's argument that maybe the justices themselves don't see it that way, even if the rest of the country does. And that's not a defense saying that I think Justice Gorsuch is a good justice or anything like that. I'm just merely pointing out that, to Lance's point, it does happen. However, it's also important to note that the vast majority of decisions, which none of us ever hear about because they're not things that shake the earth, fall very often along the court's typically ideological lines of whatever party appointed them. In other words, the way they ended up voting was very much expected. It was of no surprise, and it was right in line with whatever party would have wanted them. They voted the way the party would have wanted them to vote. Yes, they do sometimes break away, and in this case, obviously, Justice Gorsuch did so because he was confronted with the ideology that he professed to hold, right? Made it clear that there was only one way for him to rule on this, that there really wasn't much room for his interpretation if he truly believed the ideology that he believed. And in this case, whether or not, again, you like Gorsuch and whether or not you think he should be a judge, he held to what he said his ideology was. And in his hearings to the Senate, he said, I am steadfast with this ideology. And here he is proving it. Now, conservatives were not happy about that, right? They were like, what are you doing? And he's saying, I'm doing what I said I was going to do, which is listen to this ideology. And in this case, this ideology comes down on this side of the issue. And I don't think it's a bad idea if the court was able, even if you're not going to go the party route, if the court was able to choose 2 or 3 of its own peers, because we often choose, and I've expressed frustration to Lance in personal life, we often delegate legal authority or legal decisions to people that have literally no legal experience whatsoever. And we expect them to make intelligent decisions. And that's not to be harsh to the Senate, because it's the Senate's job, to confirm or deny. But why are they the only ones that do that? Why would we not want judges to weigh in on whether judges should be confirmed or not? I don't know. It just seems like you should ask professionals in their field who have spent their life doing something, right? Give them some input over who they're going to work with.
But that's another misnomer. Now, yes, most of them have been judges, but there's nothing in the job description that says you have to be a lawyer or a judge to be on the Supreme Court.
Right.
The president could pick, and there's no age either.
We'll make the Devon creature the next Supreme Court justice.
Right. Or Justin T. Weller could be the next Supreme Court justice.
Or Lance, and none of us have a law degree.
Because you're a citizen. Yeah. Right. And none of us have a law degree, and none of us have ever been a judge. So, And just so people don't understand, I never want to change anything. There's one recommendation that I'd like to get your quick opinion on, and that is that federal district court rulings don't cover the entire country. That if I go to court in the district court in a federal district court in Ohio, that decision only affects the people living in that federal district. Now, obviously, if whoever was decided against is going to attempt to take it to the Supreme Court, which is another misnomer that people say, well, we're going to take this to the Supreme Court. You don't take anything to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court handpicks the cases it wants to. Just because you want to argue, right. Just because you want to argue your case in front of the Supreme Court decides its own docket. So there is no such thing as we're going to take this to the Supreme Court. And you don't have to wait till a federal district court makes the decision. The Supreme Court can pick out a local court case and say, you know what? We find that very interesting. We want to decide on it. So at any point in the process, the Supreme Court can take a case and listen to it. So some other misnomers, but that idea of, okay, it was a district court decision. It only applies to that district. I kind of like that idea. That makes sense to me.
Right.
I don't know how you feel, but that was one of the changes that we read about to the court that I kind of thought that's logical. You represent this district. Your decision should affect this district.
I think part of what we have to think about too is, the Supreme Court hears a wide variety of cases. And so when we think about something like that, the whole reason the Constitution, I think, gives them the power to establish subsidiary courts, lower courts, is so that they can delegate some of their authority, because it's just not realistic, right? I mean, there's all kinds of cases I think the Supreme Court might want to hear that they have to say no to because they just don't have the time, right? I mean, they just can't. They cannot hear every case that maybe they should hear. So I think something like a something like, giving that to the respective district courts and only allowing it to have effect in that area. I'd be interested in talking more about it, because I think there might also be an opportunity for, issues of lower importance, quote unquote, lower importance, to be delegated to like a sub-Supreme Court, something that does have rule of the land. Cause I know that a lot of people get antsy about, some district court on the other side of the country just decided something that affects me. How does that make sense? Part of the reason we have states and districts in this country and all of our congressional our congressional districts is so that we have some level of representation based on local areas, since different people need different things in different areas. So I don't know. I think it's definitely something that I think merits further conversation for sure, because I'm not initially saying no, but I'm also not immediately saying yes, because I think that without doing something else to lighten the Supreme Court's load, you'd then be putting further burden on them to say, well, a district court decided this, but it doesn't apply to everybody. So now we have to think about whether or not it should, where right now district court decides and it can be the law of the land sort of thing, unless the Supreme Court decides to hear it and overturn. So not fully opposed to it, but also wouldn't just say, yeah, let's just do it without thinking about, how it's going to affect the court as a whole. But that's what we try to do, Lance, right? We try to talk through these things and have some different conversations. So, what are we trying to accomplish here at True Chat, the company that's responsible for the state of us?
Well, you use that keyword in your answer, conversations. And so I picked up my paper and now it's time to read. True Chat's mission is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And once again, I think we've done that this time on the topic of the Supreme Court. And if you've enjoyed the show, or it's made you think a little bit, or you're really just irate and upset with us, that's great, because at least you have some feelings in your body, and that's a good thing. So tell your friends about us and get more listeners so we can have this open debate and respectful conversations that we love to have here. And tell them they can find us on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, and everywhere podcasts are found.
The word of the day was penumbra, and I think I won at 3-2, I believe. So
I didn't know it was a competition.
Well, see,
I love how the rules of the game change in the middle of the show, so Justin can win.
Exactly.
So everybody knows what he's like. That's the way the game goes.
I'm glad Lance figured it out.
Now it's a competition.
And the court's decision on the food of the day was a no-go. I think a unanimous no-go.
Next week, the word of the day will be and we'll see if Justin can keep track of the number of times. He won't even be able to speak on the topic, because he'll have to keep track of the number of times everybody says the word "and." I
think we'll just make sure that there's no word of the day on that particular episode. We'll just change the rules again, right, to fit the situation.
And that's fine. I'm not complaining. I'm just making sure everybody understands.
This is how it goes.
That the Devon creature and I did not know that there was a competition for usage of the word of the day until Justin announced himself the winner.
For the State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to our recording producer, Devin McCain, editing producer, Bradley Butch. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.